Mai had lived in quiet solitude since her husband's death 2 years ago. Her home, once echoing with laughter and weekend dinners, had turned into a museum of memories. When Lin and Tuan moved in temporarily after their wedding, the silence shifted, but not in the way Mai expected. Lin's presence brought a kind of brightness, her energy young and unburdened. Tuan, polite and helpful, seemed like the kind of man any mother would be proud to have as a son-in-law. At first, Mai regarded him as just that. Nothing more. Their lives settled into a routine. Mai handled most of the cooking and laundry, habits from years of marriage she couldn't easily break. Tuan always offered to help, even when she declined. Sometimes he lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, watching her move about with quiet reverence. She noticed, not in a suspicious way, but as a woman who hadn't felt seen in a long time. One afternoon, Mai wore an old summer dress while organizing clothes to donate. It was loose, thin, something she'd normally never wear around others, but the day was humid and she didn't expect anyone to notice. She leaned toward the balcony. A breeze swept through and lifted the hem slightly. She reached down and fixed it without thought. Behind her, Tuan sat on the couch pretending to scroll his phone, but his eyes betrayed him. They traced the curve of her legs, lingered too long. Something primal flickered inside him, uninvited and shameful. He quickly looked away when Mai turned, but not fast enough. She didn't say anything, yet the weight of that moment landed quietly between them. After that, something shifted in how Tuan watched her. He started paying attention to things others wouldn't. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the sound of her light footsteps in the morning, the faint trace of perfume that lingered in the hallway after she passed. He tried to act normal, but the awareness grew. It wasn't love, not even desire in its full form. It was fascination, forbidden and dangerous. The fact that she was older didn't matter. If anything, it deepened the pull. She carried herself with a kind of elegance that Lin, still young and vibrant, hadn't yet grown into. Mai began to sense something, though she didn't let on. There was a stillness in Tuan's presence now, an observation behind every glance. Once, while pouring tea, her hand brushed his. It was quick, but she caught the sudden breath he took in. She didn't pull back immediately. A pause, just long enough to acknowledge the electricity. Then she moved away, heart unsettled. That night, she stood in front of her mirror longer than usual, staring at her reflection, searching for what he might be seeing. She hated herself for wondering. Lin remained blissfully unaware. She spoke of future plans, vacations, work stress. Tuan nodded and smiled, but Mai could see his mind drifting. When Lin walked away, Mai would find Tuan's gaze returning to her, hesitant but persistent. She said nothing. There was nothing to accuse. No act had been committed. Still, a tension began to knot her stomach, growing tighter each time they shared the same room. She convinced herself it was her imagination. Perhaps she was the one projecting. Perhaps loneliness made her misread everything. But late one evening, as she stood outside watering her plants, she felt it again. Tuan stood in the doorway, watching her silhouette in the dim porch light. She turned slowly, locking eyes with him. No words, just a charged pause. Then he looked down, muttered something about helping Lin, and disappeared inside. She stood there unmoving, her heart beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. This was not the life she imagined for herself at 52, navigating the moral quicksand of her own daughter's husband. Yet something unspoken had begun, and neither of them had the strength to name it. Not yet. Mornings became quieter, but heavier. Tuan no longer avoided Mai. Instead, he sought her out in small, calculated ways. If Lin left early for work, he lingered longer at breakfast, offering to wash dishes or fix small things around the house. His gestures were always justifiable, but the silence between them grew thick with things unsaid. One morning, as Mai stood in her robe brushing her hair by the kitchen window, she noticed Tuan watching her from the hallway. He didn't speak, didn't move. Just stared for a second too long before pretending to look for his keys. Her hand paused mid-brush, then continued, as if nothing had happened. The air between them changed. It wasn't flirting. It was quiet, dangerous awareness. He began to memorize her movements, how she always stirred tea 3 times before sipping, how she rubbed her thumb against her palm when thinking. She noticed the shift, too. It showed in the way he adjusted his shirt whenever she entered the room, in how he lingered close even when space was unnecessary. And yet, nothing concrete had happened. That was the trap. Nothing to point to, but everything felt different. Once, while folding laundry, Mai found one of her silk scarves missing. The next day, she saw it tucked inside a book on the hallway shelf.
She didn't ask.
She didn't need to. Another time, he walked behind her in the hallway and brushed her back lightly to pass, a touch so soft it could have been innocent. But her breath hitched anyway. They both knew it wasn't accidental. Later, in her room, she stood staring at the spot where his fingers had grazed her dress, wondering how far this had already gone without touching skin. Tuan started changing too. Less affectionate with Lin, more distracted. He rarely looked her in the eye during dinner. When she leaned against him, his body stiffened, as if contact with her felt wrong. Mai watched it happen silently. She hated herself for being the reason. She hated the power she hadn't asked for, but now carried. Lin remained blind to it all, too busy planning their anniversary trip, full of joy and excitement. She even asked Mai for help with a gift. The irony crushed her point one evening. Tuan came into the kitchen while Mai was preparing vegetables. Their hands met over the same knife. Neither pulled away. Time slowed. He whispered her name so low it almost wasn't real. She didn't respond, only turned her face slightly, enough for him to see her eyes close for a moment. Then she walked out, leaving everything half-prepared. In her room, she sat with her back against the wall, hands shaking. She had not kissed him, had not touched him beyond that shared second. But she knew it didn't matter anymore. What was breaking wasn't just a boundary, it was identity, loyalty, everything that defined right from wrong. Tuan avoided her the next morning, but his silence wasn't clean. It was restless, unfinished. They were trapped in a dance without music, circling each other with unsteady feet. Even when Lin was present, the tension didn't leave. It only hid behind fake smiles and polite chatter. Mai felt herself unraveling quietly. Every time she caught his eyes on her, something stirred she could no longer deny. A mix of desire and dread, longing and disgust. She couldn't tell which was stronger, only that both were winning. By the end of the week, Mai started dressing differently. More conservative, more muted, but it didn't change anything. His gaze had already seen too much. He had memorized the lines of her hands, the scent of her soap, the texture of her voice in the morning. He had crossed over long before she realized she let him. And now, she couldn't unfeel it. The betrayal hadn't happened in bed. It had happened in glances, in pauses, in stolen moments no one else would ever notice. And that made it even worse. The house felt different with Lin gone for the weekend. It wasn't silence that changed things, Mai was used to that, but the way silence now felt expectant. She tried to stay busy, rearranging shelves, cleaning drawers she hadn't touched in months, but nothing occupied her long enough. Tuan was still there, moving quietly, saying little. Every time they crossed paths, the air seemed to freeze for a beat too long. Neither dared speak about what was happening between them, but it lived in every glance, every silence. By evening, the rain had started. It poured heavily, drumming against windows, softening the edges of the house. Mai prepared dinner as usual, trying to hold on to normalcy. Tuan joined her without being asked. They moved around each other cautiously, every step carefully measured. He asked simple questions. She answered without meeting his eyes. After they sat to eat, the silence stretched between them like a thread pulled too tight. Tuan's voice broke through, softer than usual. He spoke of loneliness, not directly, but in metaphors. Of how routines can feel like cages. Of how sometimes the people closest to us feel furthest away. Mai listened, hands folded in her lap. His words weren't dramatic. They were honest. For the first time, she didn't feel older. She felt seen. Something inside her softened, and she hated how much she wanted to be seen that way again. She stood to clear the plates. He followed, close behind. Their hands met again. Neither moved. This time there was no pretending it was nothing. He looked at her, searching for refusal. She didn't give it. She didn't offer anything either, just stayed still. He moved closer, slowly, and when his hand touched her cheek, she didn't pull away. Her breath faltered. His did too. Their faces inches apart, she closed her eyes. The kiss came soft, uncertain, almost apologetic. It didn't last long, but it was enough. Enough to tear through the silence they'd been hiding behind. She stepped back first, whispered that it couldn't happen. Not because she didn't want it, but because she did. That was the danger. She left him standing there, wet-eyed and silent. In her room, she pressed her back to the door, every part of her shaking. The chaste of the moment still on her lips, her guilt louder than the storm outside. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't innocent. But she also wasn't prepared for how deeply that one moment would undo her. Tuan didn't try to talk to her again that night. He didn't knock. But she knew he hadn't slept either. They had crossed something irreversible, and neither of them could pretend anymore. The problem wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that came before it. The thoughts, the stolen seconds, the hunger that had been growing in silence. A physical line had finally been broken, but the emotional one had shattered long ago. When Lin called that night to say goodnight, Mai overheard Tuan's voice on the phone. Calm, even as if nothing had happened. It made her stomach turn. Not because he lied, but because of how easily he could. She wondered if he felt the same shame, the same burning weight pressing down on her chest. Or if this had been leading here all along, and she had just been too weak to stop it. The rain didn't stop. The storm raged on through the night, but the real damage had already been done. She sat awake, staring at nothing, her hands clenched together, her breath shallow. This wasn't an affair of the body. Not yet. But it was an affair of the soul. And it had started long before either of them had the courage to admit it. Now, courage wouldn't be enough. The days that followed were quiet but not peaceful. Nothing more had happened between them, yet everything had changed. They spoke less, avoided being in the same room, but even in distance, the weight of that single moment remained. Tuan no longer lingered in the kitchen. He didn't watch her anymore. He didn't have to. What was once curiosity had become something heavier, regret, or perhaps fear of what else he might still do. Mai, too, pulled inward. She wore only high collars, avoided eye contact, and barely spoke more than necessary. It wasn't guilt that silenced her. It was knowing that silence was now the only thing keeping everything from breaking. Lin returned from her trip with joy, full of stories and gifts. Mai forced a smile, listened, helped unpack, nodded at all the right places. But when she looked at her daughter, something cracked inside her. Lin's trust, her innocence, her unwavering belief that the people she loved could never betray her. Mai could no longer meet her gaze for too long. Tuan did his best to act normal too, but Lin noticed how distant he'd become. When she kissed him, he barely responded. When she asked if he was tired, he said he was just stressed. She believed him. She always believed him. The tension grew louder. Lin asked Mai one morning if everything was all right. Mai froze for a moment too long, then lied. Said she was just overwhelmed with housework, aging, nothing serious. Lin hugged her and promised they'd plan a spa day. That hug nearly broke her. Tuan stood at the door that afternoon, watching silently as Mai folded clothes in the laundry room. Their eyes met briefly. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But she could see it, his guilt, his confusion, the war inside him. And maybe her reflection mirrored the same. What they did wasn't a secret for long. It never is. A week later, Lin found a page torn from Mai's old journal while cleaning the desk drawer. A scribbled confession. Half-finished thoughts, lines crossed out, but enough to tell the truth. Enough to raise every red flag. She read it 3 times, her hands trembling. Then she confronted Mai, no screaming, no dramatic questions, just one quiet, broken sentence. Did it happen? Mai didn't lie. She couldn't. Her voice cracked when she said it was a mistake. Said it was one kiss, nothing more. But Lynn's face made it clear. Anything was too much. Her world had been pulled out from under her by the two people she trusted most. Tuan walked in during the conversation. He saw the paper in Lynn's hand and said nothing. Guilt poured off him like heat. Lynn turned to him, asking why. He couldn't answer. He just stood there, frozen. That silence was enough. It said everything. Lynn didn't cry, not then. She packed her things without speaking, moved out that night, didn't leave a note behind. She didn't need to. The hollow in the house was louder than any words could have been. Tuan left 2 days later. Mai didn't ask where he went. She didn't want to know. She remained in the house alone again, like before, but now it wasn't grief she carried. It was the ache of betrayal she had helped cause. She moved through the room slowly, as if every corner remembered what she'd done. The kiss played over in her mind, not out of longing, but as punishment. She replayed every second, every choice she didn't stop. In the end, it wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a series of silent permissions, layered until consequences were inevitable. She stood at the balcony one evening, looking out at the same street, the same breeze. Nothing had changed outside, but she had. Her face looked older now, not from age, but from truth. There was no one left to explain anything to. No apology that could fix the fracture she had caused. Infidelity hadn't come with fire. It had crept in quietly, stolen in through glances, through silence, through the hunger to be seen again. And now it had left only absence. Not of people, but of trust, of peace, of the version of herself she could no longer look at in the mirror.